You may be fully aware of it, you may not, that today is Super Bowl Sunday. I'm sure there's lots of churches around the country where the message is on the Super Bowl. This one's not. But it's a message that, in a sense, is relevant if you talk about Super Bowl or things like that. It's actually in two parts. The series that I actually am in has been a series on a dimension of the prophetic realm. This is God Knows Part 3 in what amounts to a prophetic series. I've tried to read at least one verse out of Isaiah, starting with Isaiah 41, 42, last week 42, this week 43, a verse out of 43 and 44. It's a section of the passages that's been so meaningful to me in this dimension. God knows, and the thing about God that is at least the characteristic of God that is identified in these chapters up to 45, 46, is that He knows what's going to happen. He will tell you ahead of time. He can explain what has been happening before. And so sometimes it takes having to have gone through it to be able to really understand. Or so much of the Bible is God telling us ahead of time, this is what I'm going to do, this is what's going to happen, and we watch it take place. Sometimes hundreds of years it takes, sometimes thousands of years, and sometimes just in a much shorter time periods as we look in our lives. So I want to look at a passage out of Isaiah 43. Reading Isaiah 43:9. Let all the nations be gathered together, and let the people be assembled, who among them can declare this and show us former things. Who can declare this is what's going to take place? Who can fully explain what has already happened, saying it? Who can show us the former things? Let them bring out their witnesses. So he's saying, if you can do that, I can. The Bible, the Scriptures, Israel, our lives are a demonstration of that. Bring out your witnesses that they may be justified, or let them hear and say, it is truth. Let them hear, it's the truth. God is the truth. He knows what is going to be taking place. That's Isaiah 43, Isaiah 44, verse 7. Who can proclaim as I do? God speaking. Who can declare, in essence, ahead as I do? Let him declare it and set it in order for me, since I appointed the ancient people and the things that are coming and shall come. Let them show them to them. It's I've chosen to read this also out of the New International or New Living Translation. It reads this way, the same verse, Isaiah 44:7. Who is like me? Let him step forward and prove to you his power. Let him do as I have done since the ancient times, when I established a people and explained the future. That's so practical. That is the reality. Who is like me? New International Version. Who is like me? Let him step forward and prove to you his power. Let him do as I have done since ancient times, when I established a people and explained its future. Speaking of people in the most direct sense, the nation of Israel, they're his witnesses. He says over and over in this section, they are my witness, you're my witness, of him telling ahead of time what was going to take place and explaining it. That I view them as just magnificent. Some other passages that are along this realm that explain what God is doing. I love Acts 3:18. But those things which God foretold by the mouth of all his prophets. What he's doing is God is foretelling by the mouth of all his prophets. So when we think of last week, the analogy actually came to me in the message that we're more like mailmen, that hopefully we're accurately carrying letters that, so to speak, the prophetic words that God has given. It's like we're a mailman, we're delivering it. And so when we deliver it to people, a common phrase, as I mentioned, it came to me last week is, boy, you read my mail. If someone was saying, you delivered a prophecy, and boy, you said very clearly what was taking place, where I am, I understand. And that's a phrase, a common phrase we'll use. You certainly read my mail. It was God who was reading your mail. And they were just being a very accurate mailman. And I love this out of Acts 3:18. But those things which God foretold by the mouth of all his prophets, that the Christ should suffer. So this is speaking, Peter is speaking this, Acts chapter 3. And he's speaking, okay, God told this ahead of time, that of what his Christ would experience. That was prophecy. That was God foretelling the future. That was God making it clear, this is what's going to take place. And Peter, Acts chapter 3, the message that he gave when the man was healed at the temple, he's explaining what was going on. And he said that the Christ would suffer, he has thus fulfilled. So that's a part of his message. The things God said, foretold ahead of time through his prophets. That's what prophecy is. It is God speaking ahead of time. It is not us. We are not seeking to put ourselves in the place of a God. We are seeking to put ourselves in a place who is attentive to God, who's listening to God, who can be a mouthpiece, if God so chooses, for God, and or a vehicle through whom God would foretell the future. God would let you know what is coming. Magnificent passage, Acts 3:18. But those things which God foretold, it was God foretelling by the mouth of all his prophets, that the Christ would suffer, he has thus fulfilled. Okay, how should we regard what God has foretold? How should we look at it? What responsibilities do we have? I like this regarding what Jesus did. This is a magnificent declaration. This is an example of Jesus recognized God foretold what was going to take place, and he came into agreement, and he ordered his life to be in agreement with it, to be consistent with it. It reads this way, John 19:28. That Jesus is on the cross, and this is how I read this. You may read it differently. This is how I read it. He's there after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished. I think Jesus knew the Scriptures. He had better understanding than we do. He had understanding that God foretold about him and what was going to take place, what he was going to do. Yeah, I believe he was fully aware of those things, or more so aware than any of us have really ever been. I think that'll take heaven. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, I think that means he was kind of like, he was running through Scripture, he was running through prophecies, he was running through what God foretold about what the Christ would do, what the Christ would experience. I think he went through Isaiah 53, which gives a lot of detail of what was going to take place. And knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the Scripture might be fulfilled, he said, I thirst. He said that. You may see it and that in a different context, and you may be right. You may be more accurate than the context in which I see it. I see it, and it was very purposeful. that it was very calculating on Jesus' part, that it was very, he was adding up, so to speak, what scriptures have been fulfilled. What has he seen? What does he bear a responsibility for? Meaning, in this instance, he saw that he was to say something in relative to how thirsty that he was. His mouth, because he's quoting out of the Psalms, a passage, at least that's what scholars believe, that's what Jesus was referencing, that this was very purposeful. He knew God had foretold what would take place, what he would be experiencing on the cross, and summing it all up, a simple summary of what the Psalms, I believe 22, what Psalms 22 talks about, is a summary of it is, I thirst. It was purposeful. It was meaningful. Today is purposeful. It's purposeful. He said. And after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scriptures might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. It was deliberate. So the things that God foretold that impact us, that come into the sphere of our lives, there's a dimension of it that you and I have to, in a sense, act in harmony with it. That in a sense we have, this guides us, this directs us, this, in a sense, dictates to us what God's purposes are, that there will be purposes that He will say ahead of time in your own life, in my life. The thing that I've said on many occasions, I'm not going to tell the long story again. Walking out of Bryan College, the end of my freshman year, seeing Faye, knowing that's not a direction I was going in, that's not a direction she was going in at all. We were going in varied a Christ life, yes. A relationship with each other, that's just not the direction we were going in. And I heard myself say, that's the girl I'm going to marry. Somehow I assumed that was the Lord, and I needed to, and my response was, it was the right response. So I don't know if there was an angel beside me that said, okay, now here's what you need to do. You need to say, I'm going to get to know her. And you need to pay attention to her. You need to watch her now very closely. You need to spend the next year watching her. Do you understand what this means? There could have been a being next to me that said that. So I'm looking at Jesus as an example of prophecy, was the foretelling of God. He knows the future. He knows what's going to take place. And practically, in reference to Jesus on the cross, I believe Jesus was going over those scriptures. Was he delirious? I don't believe he was delirious. I believe that he, in full assent, he fully committed himself to what he was called to of the Father as the Christ, as the Redeemer. And he was enough attentive of the passages, the scriptures on the cross, things that what we call the 7 final declarations of Christ, the things that he declared on the cross. He was aware of it, and it's in the realm of prophecy. It's in God foretelling what the Christ would suffer. And so this is it. This is what we believe Jesus was recombining and saying it in a simple fashion. I thirst. Out of Psalm 22:15, my mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Which it was the Father's purposes, that these are things that the Christ, the Redeemer, would experience. And so Jesus, in fulfilling the purposes of the Father and fulfilling what had been given to him, he deliberately said, I thirst. You can do that. You can deliberately order what you say, how you act, what you give yourself to. You can deliberately do that. And I'm speaking of in the context where you're convinced God has spoken. God has done this. God has told you what is coming, so to speak. He deliberately did that. Can I see how out of this is what at least theologians, it's the common one that they believe this is what Jesus was speaking out of when he summed it together and said, I thirst. He was fully aware of what God had spoken. I do. In the practical sense of another individual. That's the example of Christ, of another individual, Cyrus, King Cyrus, reading out of Ezra 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. So that was God foretelling what was going to take place in the future, and he was doing it through a prophet named Jeremiah. And in the book of Ezra, it's talking about King Cyrus and what King Cyrus came to understand. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord. There's one way it takes place. One way is like Jesus, as a practical example. You're cognizant of it. You're aware of it. It's meaningful to you. It's clear to you. It seemed to me, if that's the girl I'm going to marry, I better get to know her. That seemed to me to be the response. How did that come to me? I believe this is an example of, this was God's intention. It was God's purpose for Faye, that she would have as a husband. I don't know if that was a privilege or not. He wanted me to have the privilege of having her for a wife, and that's the girl I'm going to marry. I believe it was in this direction that Cyrus is saying that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia. How does it happen sometimes? Is the Lord stirs up the spirit, your spirit. There are times that's how it comes to you. That God knows what he wants for you, and it's a wonderful way that it's stated here, that he stirs up he stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he, Cyrus, made a proclamation throughout all the kingdoms and put it in writing, saying, he was talking about the next verse is, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth, the Lord God of heaven has given me, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judea. We believe this was said around, these are just around 537, 538, 536. That's around the time period BC, 537 years before Christ. And we actually think Christ was maybe a couple of years before that. But just keeping it in number, Cyrus came to understand that there was something that was going to take place. It was in the prophetic record. He acknowledged the prophetic record had come from God, and he was explaining it, he was detailing it, he was speaking it. And so he was speaking it at a time period, and he made quite a proclamation. I'm not going through that. This is Jeremiah, what we believe he was addressing out of Jeremiah 25:12. So Jeremiah, God is foretelling the future. He's actually foretelling how long Israel was going to be in captivity to Babylon. God told them that they were going to be put in captivity. Jeremiah kind of referred to as, in some dimensions, the weeping prophet because of what was going to be taking place. He suffered heavily. He was imprisoned a fair amount of his time. And so this is Jeremiah speaking, and we think about 588 BC. We don't know. The Bible program that I use for timelines, it's their best guess. So this is a guess. So this is what Jeremiah said in Jeremiah 25:12. Then it will come to pass when 70 years are completed. There are times God gives specific time periods. This is one of them. He gave one to Abraham. And he said 400 years are going to come to pass. And when those 400 years in the fourth generation, so there's some dimensions that a generation that the Bible is speaking about. I don't believe every time the Bible uses the word generation, it's speaking of 100 years. But in that one where God was speaking to Abraham and telling him 400 years, and then they're going to be released and they're going to come out of wherever they are, they're going to come out with great riches. So this time that he's using Jeremiah to explain, there are prophecies that you're going to go into captivity because you've denied the Lord, you have rejected him. And God was telling, I know the time period, I know how long it's going to be. And in this instance, and he said that when 70 years are completed, and so you have to, look in the Bible, when did the 70 years start? When did what was taking place to Israel? And the beginning point time was before this. 70 years are completed that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, says the Lord. It's going to be 70 years. And this was the time period, that 70 years was deemed to be up when Cyrus went and conquered Babylon. It was seemingly an impenetrable city with massive walls. That it was a city. And God, it appears in Isaiah 44 and 45 where he's talking about Cyrus. He talks about drying up the water. And among the things that God, the specifics that God gave as he was talking about Cyrus who was to come, and in Jeremiah's prophecy, this was Isaiah I'm talking about, that the water would be dried up. That Babylon was conquered by Cyrus, running kind of through the middle of the city was a great river, and they dried up the river, and King Nebuchadnezzar was having a big feast, and they intentionally diverted the water, and they walked in on the riverbank, which went under the walls, and the double doors were open, and so very specifically, God told them the water. So in Isaiah, about 150 years in advance, the water's going to be dried up, the double doors are going to be open, and you can go in. And that's how they believed Babylon was conquered, not because they were strong enough to deal with the walls and all that, that they were prompted, they were given, dry up the water, walk in there, some of the double doors that were lining both sides of the city was on both sides of that river, that they just walked in there, the army, Cyrus and his army, just walked into Babylon uncontested, because this massive wicked celebration was going on. And this is when Daniel was saying, your life is weighed and it's measured and it's over. And God linking all those things together. God knows the future. What about us? What about us? What about the times in which we live? I put it this way. What about our lives? What about New Covenant Fellowship? Is it relevant? Does God know ahead of time? So, I want to speak to it. I want to be attentive to where we are. We're good. You don't hear me say that very often. We're good. So I intend to trumpet it. What about the times in which we live? What about what's going on in our world? Our world, the calling that is in us, is been heavily impacted by what God has done at Kansas City and the Kansas City House of Prayer. We've been very heavily impacted in our earliest days, and Bob Jones, who's with the Lord now 10 years. He's been in heaven 10 years. And I don't know if you spent a lot of time paying attention to what is going on in Kansas City. It's a tragedy. It's awful. It was unexpected. I don't think there was anybody, except maybe someone who had prophetic hints from the Lord. Apart from that, and there are some people who we find are beginning to talk about that that they had some prophetic learning, meaning it wasn't because they were so smart they figured it out. It's because they knew God was telling them information. God was foretelling what was going to take place. They had understanding, and it's been unbelievably grievous. And this is October. In October, that Mike Bickle, who God used to, through Bob Jones, initiate the founding and leading of Kansas City International House of Prayer, hasn't lived what he was proclaiming. And he has not lived. And it's now coming out. And what about the times in which we live? And I've put the October 2023 Kansas City bombshell that he's accused of sexual wrongdoing. He's accused of, and it's been proven to be true. He's been accused of heavy-handed pastoring. I can't speak to that. So I put these words. Did God know this was going to happen? Has he spoken to it? So has he foretold this is coming? I think the answer is yes. The October 2023 is when it quote-unquote broke. I think there were people who have known about this and have just not been speaking. But this is when it broke in the news, and at least I became aware of it. Now, what about Kansas City IHOP? What's going to take place? Now, what about Mike Bickle? I think the precedent, God established the precedent in Bob Jones. Bob Jones was not able to experience and walk in what he desperately wanted to, and he had quite a revelatory encounter in which he realized you've been injured in the battle and you're not able to experience some of the things that could have been available to you, but you've been injured in the battle and you're kind of in the stands. You're watching what's taking place. I think that precedent has been set. Do I think Mike Bickle is going to return to this place? And this is not really about Mike Bickle. No, I think like Bob Jones and the precedent that was set with Bob Jones, I don't think he'll experience what God intended for him to experience. And the prices that he's paid, which are pretty heavy prices, the prices Bob paid. But he got injured in the battle, and Mike Bickle made choices in the battle. And what about Mike Bickle? I don't believe he is returning as Bob Jones didn't return to the place that was for him. Now, what about wounded people? Oh, there's so many wounded people. So many wounded people. they're in the Lord's hands. They're under the Lord's care. Some of them will walk away. Some of them will be injured for the rest of their life. Some of them will fully recover. Those injured in what Mike has done and misrepresented, and others that may come out. Now, what about us? What about New Covenant? What about the calling on us? That as this proceeded, it was like, God, what does this mean? Does it have meaning for us? New Covenant Fellowship. So I've put it this way: Kansas City IHOP, intercession 24/7. What does it mean for it's going on at the moment? Is that going to end? Is it not going to accomplish what God's purposes? What about what directly impacted us the day we started as a congregation, November the 1st, 1981? That was our first day. I fully believe we are among those. That's when the first induction notices were going to be mailed out for the end time global harvest, so to speak. And I fully believe we received one on that day. That's a long story. I mean, what about that? Is that contaminated now? Is that ended? The Acts 2 anointings that Bob spoke to about 10 years after Kansas City began. And I mean by that found the reversal of the wine, the fire, and the wind. What about those? Are those still available to us? What about the billion soul plus harvest? Is that, if Kansas City, I guess I am hearing that there are more and more voices that are saying Kansas City will never recover. They won't make it. It's done for. That ministry cannot succeed. I'm separating Mike Bickle, who has been separated from Kansas City International House of Prayer. And the current leadership, I think the leadership is going to turn over. But the ministry, the calling, the Kansas City House of Prayer, I am looking at that as an entity in and of itself. The leadership that was there with Mike Bickle, I'm not speaking to that. To Mike Bickle, I'm not speaking to him. I'm speaking to the international, the 24/7 House of Prayer. Will they fulfill the calling that's on their lives? And spin-off or impact, does it impact us as a congregation in East Tennessee? Has God spoken to that? And I believe the answer is yes. Bob Jones and the Russia calling. God opened up an opportunity. So he's been dead 10 years. So this is 2004-ish. 2014 is when Bob passed on. So this was 4-ish. I was given an opportunity to do an interview of Bob Jones in his home of the things that God has shown him regarding Russia. That door was opened up through a good friend of mine, and so we went and we did that. We did the interview of Bob Jones, and the two things, the Hudson Taylor vision that God showed Hudson Taylor, and Sister Gwen Shaw, the book that she wrote, The Light Will Come from Russia. Bob was unaware of those two things, and he explained in an encounter that he had in 1995 with an angel that he called the archangel over the Red Army of God, the Christian army over the Russian Red Army of God. He explained as part of the 4 proofs that angel gave to him that he was speaking to Bob the truth about the prophetic calling on Russia for a Russian Red Army of God, and for the Gwen Shaw and the light will come from Russia, that he would send to Bob Jones over the next several months literature, prophecies from true prophecies from people of old. Among the two, the only two that Bob mentioned are the two that have been so instrumental to me, to us here at New Covenant, are the Hudson Taylor vision and the booklet and the interview that we did with Sister Gwen Shaw, and the things that she prayed and said over us and proclaimed over us, Gary Beaton and myself, as these things were being set in motion. What about them? Are they impacted? So, how it happened. I began saying back in October, after this stuff began to break, of which we didn't know the magnitude of what is now known. It's far worse. It's awful. The magnitude of it, I began thinking, oh my, is this affecting us? New Covenant? Is this going to invalidate the things that have come to us via the International House of Prayer, Bob Jones? Is this... I remember I heard a story, what came to me. I remember I heard a story that Mike Bickle told, a Bob Jones story of an experience that Bob had that talked about the future. I remember that, but I just remember so few details. I remember it was involving a baseball game, but I don't remember any of the details, but I remember it. And so the gal who helps me, Cindy, who helps me do research, a lot of it, I gave her that assignment back in October. Cindy, can you start looking among the thousands of recordings that exist? And I know that Mike spoke about something Bob saw that involved a baseball game, but it's been maybe 25 years ago. I just don't really remember it, and it's very important to me now. And so Cindy spent about 2 weeks back in October of 2023 and couldn't find anything. And she looked. And 2 weeks ago, so this is the 11th of February, 2024, in which I'm speaking these things. I came back in when I came in the building, and I said, Cindy, it's just like I've been prompted again, that there's a story that exists that I've heard that involves Bob Jones and talking about the future of what was going to happen to IHOP in the future. And I've heard Mike tell that story, but it's been years ago, and I know it exists, and I know you've looked hard. I think you spent almost 2 weeks searching for it. Could you just humor me, and could you look a little further? It wasn't an interview where Mike was talking to Bob Jones. Mike was telling the story, and she kind of concentrated on where Mike and Bob were together, and so she realized this was a different avenue, the future. So I'm going to take a time out, and I'm going to back up to about 25 years ago. Renewal had come to New Covenant through Toronto, and it was a very wonderful time period. And that was the first time I had heard about the prophetic history of the International House of Prayer. And I started listening to it, and I was so intrigued that the miraculous things that occurred that Mike Bickle talked about, really what happened in the opening years of it, the first 10-ish years of it. I was so taken with it, and what I had was a CD copy. I didn't have a video copy. And I felt like what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell people I'm going to play one of these a day on Mondays. I'm going to do it on a Monday night, and they're going to be audio only. There's not videos, and it's going to talk about the prophetic history of IHOP. But it touches us. It touches our lives. I believe we're included in this, in the calling of God on us. And I had a very good friend that I had have a lot of respect for. Had then, and he said, "I wouldn't do that, Russ. I don't think people would come." And in essence, if you do it, I will come. But I don't think people in general are going to come. I don't think you should do it. And I just felt like I think I need to do it. I'll work real hard and make real notes ahead of time so they have notes ahead of time. And we did. And way more people came than any of us expected. And the notes that were done a week ahead of time for each one were of immense benefit. And this individual came. He said he would come. He did come. He did acknowledge this turned out differently than I thought it would. You know, Russ, I'm glad you did what you felt like you ought to do. And but somebody took those notes of 25-ish years ago, and they put the notes together in a file folder and a set of file folders in the filing cabinet of New Covenant Fellowship, and they put a copy of the DVD, CDs, it was CD, they put a copy of the CDs, and Mike was saying back then, if you get one of my CDs, what my copyright means is you have permission to copy it and disperse it. And so we did. We played it, and whoever, I'm assuming it was Vicki, at that time, Vicki Pettit years ago, and she did the each one of those and did a copy of this. I'm saying that to say we ultimately found that story in our own filing cabinet. That's one of the primary reasons that I believe this is relevant to us. I know that I had Cindy search all over websites, search through, there's so many records that's available in IHOP libraries and so on. Search. Where she found it in the filing cabinet downstairs in the office. So this is a story that I've heard several months ago, 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, she found it. That's what she found. It was here. This is what happened. This was 2 years into IHOP. They'd had 2 magnificent years, that the most dramatic prophetic revelatory experiences that they had in the first 15 months, 2 years. And this was the 2-year mark of what they call the 21-day fast, the first initiating 21-day fast. The 2-year mark was just about to come up. It was May the 19th, I have this in the notes, 1985. Bob Jones stood up in a public meeting, and he said, I have the word of the Lord. And he had the microphone, it was public, and Mike Bickle was there, and he said, and you're not going to like this. You're going to be filled with unbelief. And Mike didn't like it because Mike explained that that's what Bob's way of saying I was going to be skeptical. And he said that this is what he said. At the 11th hour, at 5 minutes till 12, the Kansas City prayer movement is going to be considered, it is not going to accomplish what is being said now, no way to understand how it's going to recover. Bob was saying, I've been shown that that's going to happen, and it's going to be counted out. But he said, but at the 11th hour, God wanted me to tell you this is what was going to happen. We, the Kansas City Fellowship, would be counted out. The prayer movement would be counted out. But God wanted you to know at the last moment, at 5 minutes till 12, at the 11th hour, God was going to bring a victory. God was going to grant victory. And he wanted you to know that. And so in order to confirm it, he has told me how he's going to confirm that 11th hour victory is going to take place in a number of years from now. He's speaking in 1985. In 1985 is when he's speaking. May the 19th, 1985. And he said, and God's going to give a sign that that's what's going to happen. But he said the sign, he said the Lord is going to break in with a victory, and he will give a confirming sign. And he told Mike Bickle that sign is going to be professional baseball. And Mike told him, I don't understand what you're talking about. This was public. This was going on a public gathering. And Bob said, well, it's going to be the professional baseball. And Mike's declaration is, he said to Bob, that's so juvenile. That's so juvenile. God's not going to do that. And he's going to bring a sign through the Kansas City Royals that's going to be a sign that at the last moment, they're going to experience a victory that's going to say, so is the Kansas City House of Prayer movement that's geared for the end-time harvest. That's what's going to happen, and God's giving an example. This was 39 years ago that this took place, in really just a couple of months, 39 years ago. It was the Kansas City Royals, and that year was going to be the 1985 World Series. And Mike was just, I can't believe this is happening, Bob. And so in the brief, Kansas City Royals, they'd had a fair amount of baseball success. They'd never won the World Series. That year, after Bob announced this, they promptly lost 6-7 games in a row. They weren't doing that great. They kind of limped along. They came to the end of the season, and they had to win the very last game in order to make it into the playoffs. They made it into the playoffs, and Bob was saying, this is a sign. They are going to make it. They're going to be counted out. Nobody's going to believe it, but they're going to make it. He first made these announcements in May of 1985. The World Series and so on was played in September, October. There are 3 series that, so to speak, that are played. There's the divisional series, the American League West divisional series. They were behind 3-1, and they ended up winning that series 4-3. When they were behind 3-1, everybody counted out Kansas City. And Bob was saying, they're going to win. I'm telling you. He said, I'm not a baseball fan, but they're going to win. That went to the pennant, where the American League would then play the National League and come down to the 2 winning teams in the American League and then the National League, or the pennant for the American League, to come down to the final team for the American League and come down for the final team for the National League. They were behind, again, Kansas City Royals, 3-1. And Bob said, I'm telling you, they're going to win. So he's now talking in September, October, after the season has gone by and it's now the playoff, the end. And they won 4-3. I've checked all this out multiple times. And then the World Series came, and they won the World Series. They were behind, same thing. In the World Series, they got behind 3-1. And something that had never happened before up to this point in time in the World Series is the first 2 games that they played in their home stadium, of which they play some of the games in the home stadium of both teams. They lost both games. That had never happened before, and that team go on to win the World Series. That happened. They won 4-3. And Bob Jones came in the day before the final game of the World Series. It was tied at 3-3. Bob came in to a leadership meeting at Kansas City because he was telling them, God is giving us a sign that what's going to happen, Kansas City is going to be counted out. So this was in 1985. This was 39 years before this stuff had come out about Mike Bickle and what's been going on. And he said, Bob said in this leader, about 300 people were present, Mike declared. And he said, well, God told me the number is 11. The number's 11. And Mike said to Bob on the tape of this, well, 11 what? Bob said, I don't know, but 11 stands for the 11th hour, And God said the number is 11 because of the 11th hour victory win that is going to happen to this as a prayer movement. He never said that Mike Bickle would be restored, that he would be found out, so to speak. That was never said. It was all declared in reference to the prayer movement, and that Kansas City Royals won Game 7, and the score was, the Kansas City Royals won Game 7, and the score was 11-0. Unbelievable. It was unbelievable. That's the story. Lots of the news media and so on said all kinds of things regarding the Miracle World Series that had just taken place. They made fun, some of them made fun of, where is Kansas City? Mike read some of the articles. Does anybody know where Kansas City is? You'll have to get your atlas out to find where Kansas City, because they just won a Miracle World Series, and just spoof making fun. And Bob was saying that God is going to bring into great attention to Kansas City, meaning through the prayer movement that appeared to be as out of it as the Kansas City Royals appeared totally out of it by virtue of the scores of those 3 sets of games that were going to be played. But it was a picture that was being spoken then 39 years in advance. That was 39 years ago that this story took place. Because we found the CD that tells the story in our filing cabinet, that somebody had filed with the notes and the 10 or 12 CDs that are down there, and discovered which notes had this story. And because it was found here in our building, and we searched first Kansas City, we searched the internet, we found it in our own building, in our own filing cabinet. Cindy found it. And that says to me, I embrace that, this is relevant to us, just like it's relevant to Kansas City House of Prayer. So I just want to be among those in the globe who's saying to Kansas City International House of Prayer, you are going to fulfill the calling that God has on you to be an intercessory 24/7 prayer house that is leading up to and opening the way into the end-time billion-soul global harvest. Who the leadership is, how all that's going to get structured back together, I have no idea. That's all in God's hands. Like Bob Jones was not able to complete the journey that he wanted to complete, I do not believe Mike Bickle and the current leadership will, that is in any way, shape, or form complicit or been a part or a cover-up or haven't said what should be said or have treated this in a way that didn't regard the seriousness of it. I believe God will be replacing you, but that Kansas City will accomplish the calling that's on you. And I believe we, New Covenant Fellowship, the calling of God that's on us to be a people who believes. I had the experience just this past week. I was speaking with someone and saying that in Russia, that Hudson Taylor gave a prophecy in which he said that in Russia there's going to come a national spiritual awakening so great there could be never could be another like it. From Russia, it was going to spread to Europe and the rest of the world, which is the prophecy, the vision that Hudson saw twice. And that person looked at me and said, that's what, in essence, that's what the United States, you're talking, isn't that what the United States is going to do? I said, no, the prophecies are it's going to come out of Russia. Do I think the United States has a significant calling? Absolutely. But Russia has a chosen place that God chose, and it is coming. And I'm among those who prays to that end and calls for, God, your will to be done. And I believe in a major way, he's going to use Russian Orthodox. And God can use, he chose Saul of Tarsus, who was a Jewish Orthodox, non-believer, non-Christian. He chose him, and his calling was to be the apostle to the Gentiles, and through whom he would write the major portion of the New Testament. God can choose whoever he wants. So at this time period, Russ, are you aware of what's going out at Kansas City? And are you aware of all the turmoil that's out there? In some degree. I'm trying not to concentrate on that. Are you aware? And if someone were to ask me, I was asking the question, is this saying something about us? Is this calling attention to New Covenant? And my answer is yes. I think New Covenant needs to be attentive to what happened in 1985, in May of 1985. I believe we need to be attentive to that, at least I am seeking to be. And so this Sunday, which is a kind of a sports-focused Sunday in that this is Super Bowl Sunday, and Kansas City Chiefs happen to be one of the two teams that are playing. Has God showed me who's going to win? I don't have any idea. I don't know. That's not the point. I find it a very interesting Sunday. So in good conscience, the prophetic, God has spoken to it, but I believe the part that he has spoken to is that Kansas City International House of Prayer would be counted out, would come to a place where, and there are many voices that are growing that's saying, they're done. They're not going to do it. They cannot accomplish it. Through Mike Bickle, right, that is done. Through the International House of Prayer and the 24/7, I believe God has shown 39 years ago they will accomplish the calling of God. The prophetic, God is foretelling the future. It's critically important. Thank you for listening.